Hey, America's the greatest country in the world. Welcome to our special attack on Israel 1 year later. Man, it's been a year since that terrorist attack against Israel. Man, one thing I need to remind myself is that things take time. I remember when this first happened, when Hamas attacked Israel, and I thought Israel would respond immediately and Hamas would be dead and that would be the end of it by the weekend. I remember the same thing when Russia attacked Ukraine, that this thing would be over in 2 weeks. I remember the same thing with Iraq. We were told I was shock and awe, this thing will be over. And in no time, and all these things drag out for many, many years. Very interesting. I wonder where that comes from. My theory is it's something like when we go back, like, remember like in high school or middle school, you have your history book, your textbook. They don't even have textbooks like that anymore. So you have your textbook, and World War II got 5 pages. So we read about World War II for 5 pages, and then we start to think that World War II lasted as long as it takes to read about it. You know, like World War II lasted 8 minutes. And it's like, no, it was like many years. And same thing, like we read about like the Renaissance. Like, well, the Renaissance was 300 years. So like we think these things are going to get over quick, but they don't. They take a long time. So a year has gone by. You know, there's still Americans. A year went by. 1 year. Listen, what's one of our principles in America? Never leave a man behind. For a year, there were 4 Americans held hostage, not getting anywhere near the attention that they deserved, purely for political reasons, by the way, to protect Joe Biden and Kamala and the Democrats in charge. So it wasn't just Israelis who were killed, and it wasn't just Israelis who were taken hostage, Americans as well. We forget about that, or we haven't been properly told about that. So anyway, let's just refresh our memory. So early in the morning on October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched 4,300 rockets into Israel. Then Hamas terrorists paraglided over some walls and fences and made it through in many other places as well, and started massacring civilians in 21 different communities. It's believed that 6,000 members of Hamas breached the border, with another 1,000 on their side of the border launching whatever weapons they could into Israel. So 7,000 total in the attack, but 6,000 in particular breaching the border in 119 different places. Ended up killing 1,139 people. 71 were from other countries, not just Israel. That music festival, do you remember the music festival in particular? 364 people were killed at that music festival. Many women raped as well, but Hamas denied it. And then our media covered for them. I'll never forget that. Leftists in America covering for Hamas, being like, no, there's no proof that any women were raped. Meanwhile, here's a picture of a woman that was obviously raped. But I just love this idea, like that would be a bridge too far for Hamas. Sure, maybe they'll go across and kill all these Jewish people in cold blood, and then parade their bodies through the streets and keep many of them hostage in tunnels for a year, but they would never go so far as to rape anyone. Come on. What do you think they're like a bunch of monsters or something? Hamas killed 11 Americans that day. 10 were initially taken hostage. 3 were killed later in that day. A mother and daughter from Illinois were released a few weeks later. And then another American was killed in August. It was the man whose parents spoke at the Democrat convention just a couple weeks before that. And he was killed execution style. Keep in mind, Kamala has been resisting. We'll talk more about this with Joel Pollak in a little bit, but resisting any Israelis' response, like a proper response of people who want victory. And she's like, no, you can't go into Rafah. Yeah, I've studied the maps, she said. Here's that clip.
We have been clear in multiple conversations and in every way that any major military operation in Rafah would be a huge mistake. Let me tell you something. I have studied the maps. There's nowhere for those folks to go.
Yeah, she studied the maps, pressuring Israel to not attack Gaza anymore. There's no place for the people of Gaza to go. All of this aiding and abetting the terrorists. Then don't forget the college campus protests across the country, all in support of Hamas. amazing? The quick of that, just so we know the worldview that these people are operating under, this is a worldview that's been driven into the minds and souls of young people across our country. It's the Marxist worldview, oppressor and oppressed. Everything is that prism of oppressor and oppressed. So the Israelis, because they have a strong military and they're the economic superpower of the region, of course, they're the oppressors. They can do no right. And everyone else is the oppressed. So the Gazans are poor, for many, mostly by their own choice, but they're poor, therefore they are the oppressed. So Israel is the oppressors, the Gazans are the oppressed. Oppressed people can do no wrong, including killing civilians in Israel, right? That's just them responding to the occupation of the oppressors, right? That's just the freedom fighters of God, right? That kind of thing, right? So you had all these young fools just come out, or worse, by the way, but at the very least fools, come out and support Hamas on American college campuses. And my favorite part was like pretending to be in solidarity with the people of Gaza by making these encampments. This was my favorite example of this cosplaying as oppressor, as the oppressed. That's what they were. They were pretending to be the oppressed. This is at Columbia University near the end of their encampments. And I say end because it was almost graduation time, so the university finally had to crack down, and it was the end of the school year. But they shut themselves into a building. They took over a building, and they threatened to keep the janitors hostage, which is just hilarious, that you have these privileged white people at Columbia keeping black janitors hostage. But then one of the students, a spokesperson for the student group, went outside and said the university should bring them food, deliver them food from the dining hall, which is just down the block. And here's what she said.
Well, I guess it's ultimately a question of what kind of community and obligation Columbia feels it has to its students. Do you want students to die of dehydration and starvation or get severely ill, even if they disagree with you? If the answer is no, then you should allow basic, I mean, it's crazy to say because we're on an Ivy League campus, but this is like basic humanitarian aid we're asking for. Like, could people please have a glass of water?
Right, there's so much there, but calling food from the dining hall humanitarian aid, absurd. But it's not just stupid college students, it's all the way to the top of our very own government. Our government discouraging Israeli victory. Here's the great Douglas Murray.
And they have been decimated by Hezbollah, by this Shiite militia of Iran in Lebanon. And Israel goes in to get Hezbollah out, and the American government says ceasefire? No, not ceasefire, victory. Should always have been about victory. You cannot keep fighting wars that you're not allowed to win. And that's what I said from the very first moment after the 7th. Every single time Israel is made to fight wars it is not allowed to win. We in the international community were expected to see it as normal that every 15 to 20 years Israel had to fight a war in southern Lebanon. Every 2 to 3 years it had to fight a war in Gaza. Why? Every single time because the international community, including American administrations, tried to stop them and did stop them before the moment of victory. There was an Israeli politician and general who I spoke with early in this conflict who said, I had the opportunity to snuff out Hamas entirely in 2010, and I was pulled back by my government at the demand of the American government and the international community. Well done those people. Well done the people who sustained that status quo. It meant we had war after war, and now they have this. This is the fruit of their labor.
All we ever hear about this last year, all we've heard about is de-escalation. Oh, whatever you do, don't escalate things. Maybe we need to escalate sometimes, because Hamas chose this war. They chose the time, the place. We need to let Israel finish it. But the rot's everywhere. It's not just in Israel, and it's not just a rot around the world that's focused on attacking Israel. That rot is here as well. The top Hamas leadership, they're all billionaires living in Qatar. Now check this out. This is a commentator on BBC, employed by the BBC. This person says the international community has to make sure that whatever Israel does is not upending the regional order as we now know it, okay? This is like the regional order was Hamas going in and killing over 1,000 Israelis. That's the regional order. We've been in this for 12 months now of constant red lines being crossed, mostly by the Israelis. Are you kidding me? Hezbollah and Iran have played it fairly rationally, trying to always be cautious in how they respond. Okay, that's pure propaganda. Now, where does that come from? So that guy is now a professor at King's College in London. He worked for 4 years for the Qatari government. King's College has received $35 million from the Qatari government. And they're now able to spread their straight terrorist propaganda with whatever credibility is left at King's College. That is the same thing in America. And now that guy works at BBC, or also works at BBC, and is able to spread the propaganda there. The same thing in America. The country of Qatar contributes more money to Ivy League schools than any other foreign government. Now, maybe we should have a conversation about why foreign governments are investing, or not investing, well, I guess it's an investment from their perspective, but putting money into Ivy League colleges at all, like, that's kind of weird, but whatever. The country that does the most is Qatar. Qatar has a population of 2.5 million people. It's like a medium-sized city in America. That's the entire country. They've given almost $5 billion over the last 20 years to American universities. And you wonder why so many Ivy League presidents were so cautious to say anything against their Hamas overlords. Why the Ivy League presidents were so careful to call anything anti-Semitic. This terrorist rot is thoroughly throughout our country as well. It's not just focused on attacking Israel, it's all throughout our country too. Joel Pollak will be here next. He's been to Israel a couple times in the last year since this has all happened. And then Josh Hammer will be here. He has a new book out about what the connection is between Israel and all of Western civilization, and what the West needs to do to support Israel, why the West needs to be supporting Israel. That's what his new book's about. Andrew Klavan has a great line. He said, "I just hope Israel can save Western civilization before Western civilization can stop them." Speaking of Kamala and the rest. And then we'll end up talking about Christians and why Christians, I believe, why the Bible says that Christians should support the Jewish people. We'll do that all coming up right here on our special on the First TV. Thanks for being here. Spread the word. Welcome back to our special attack on Israel 1 year later. Can you believe it's been a year? I want to go right to our friend Joel Pollak, senior editor-at-large of Breitbart News and the author of the relatively new book. You have to buy this. It's called The Agenda: What Trump Should Do in His First 100 Days. You should buy it now so that when you're convincing people to vote, you have a huge list of things about why this election matters. People who say, oh, the two parties are basically the same, like, that's such nonsense, especially when you read the agenda. And then when Trump wins, now you got a ton of things that we got to get doing. So that's the book called The Agenda by Joel Pollak. Good to talk to you, Joel.
Good to be with you.
So you've been to Israel a couple times since the attack over a year ago.
5 times since the attack.
Yeah. What have you seen? What things still haunt you today?
Well, I approach this a little differently, I think, than many people. I don't feel haunted any more today than I have been the last year. What I'm looking at is the progress Israel has made. There are still 100 hostages in Gaza, and there is still so much to go, I think, in this war. But Israel has achieved so much in a year of fighting. It has smashed the Hamas military as an organization. Yes, the leaders still survive, and the hostage takers, they survive as a guerrilla army, really. But Hamas has ceased to function as a coherent military organization. They've lost over 10,000 of their terrorist fighters. So Israel has achieved that. Israel is now busy mopping up in Lebanon after destroying what was thought to be a much greater threat than Hamas, which was Hezbollah, which is backed and armed and funded by Iran. Israel simply destroyed the leadership of Hezbollah and wiped out their communication system so they couldn't coordinate their rocket fire at Israel. So instead of the waves of rocket fire, there are only sporadic firings of rockets as Israel goes town to town in southern Lebanon, exposing and destroying the weapons caches and rocket launchers and so forth that Hezbollah has hidden there among civilian homes. Israel is routing Hezbollah in the Third Lebanon War. And of course, Israel's been able to strike back at Yemen. The Houthis fire ballistic missiles once in a while, but Israel has bombed the Houthis in their port, which the United States hesitated to do. And now Israel's contemplating a strike on Iran, which launched for the second time a ballistic missile attack against Israel last week, but which again failed to do any significant damage. Israel is now well within its rights and has international support, actually, for a response to Iran, and it is choosing the time, place, and manner in which it responds. So Israel is actually much stronger after a year of fighting. That doesn't mean October 7th was a good thing, but it does point to the resilience and coherence of Israeli society. Keep in mind that many of the soldiers fighting on the front lines today are not full-time professional soldiers. Many of them are reservists. Many of them are people who have jobs and families. There are people I know, friends of mine who went to college with me in the United States, who then were either from Israel or moved to Israel. They're out there. They're fighting right now. People my age or slightly younger than me with families and so forth. They are the ones making these advances. That tells you something about the strength of Israeli society. So I don't think October 7th is in any way a happy occasion, but I don't think that it's only an occasion for mourning. I do think that there are things that the world has discovered about the strength and resilience of Israel as a nation that it didn't know on October 6, 2023.
So there's even something of significance of the fact that I asked you pretty much like a reflection of the destruction that was and the horribleness that was. And you immediately pivoted to the successes and the hope that is to come. And like, I love that. I love that you pivoted in that way.
I don't mean to make light of it. I mean, it's obviously one of the most horrific terror attacks that's ever occurred in the history of human civilization. But I also feel like there's this assumption that grief has to overwhelm us, and that the most appropriate posture for us to take in our political discourse is that of victims. And I think Israelis feel that they were victimized, but they're not victims. They feel very much in charge of their own destiny today. And so I think there's a lesson we can draw from that as Americans.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Gosh, it's so easy, and it's many people's and many cultures perhaps instinct to dwell on what was, as opposed to focusing on where we're moving.
No, it's just really us in the West. It's just the West in the latter stages of post-capitalist, post-nationalist decadence that we would prefer to cry rather than act. What Netanyahu is doing in Lebanon is raining these precision missiles down on the heads of Hezbollah commanders, these people who vowed to take over northern Israel and march to Jerusalem and slaughter in the hundreds of thousands where Hamas had only slaughtered in its thousands. What Netanyahu did was respond to that. And that used to be the West's approach. That's very much in line with our Judeo-Christian texts and moral lessons. It's very much in line with Greece and Rome and the stories that built those civilizations and fashioned them into world powers. It's not in line with Marxism, with post-colonial studies, with Michel Foucault, with all of the ideologies and ideas that have permeated our institutions and our elites and that have made us weaker in the face of these threats. I do think Americans still retain a core of resilience. You saw the way we responded after 9/11, the way the passengers took down the plane, Flight 93, when the hijackers wanted to fly it into the White House or into Congress. That's in our national character, but it does have to be cultivated. A child doesn't spring into the world ready to behave in that way in a moment of crisis. It's the kind of value that you pass on from generation to generation. Are we doing that in the United States? We are doing it, but we're doing it outside of our institutions, which is a problem. But we are doing it. I think what Israel is doing is now institutionalizing it, and that's why it's able to respond to things like October 7th.
Yeah, I think we're doing it in spite of. So what, how do I want to word this? There's one specific question. I'll remind you in a second, but what do you make of the fact that it's been a year so far? And my initial instinct was, well, let's wrap this up quick. And it's taken a year. But I don't know, you have a better perspective. Do you think a year is still pretty quick for all those things to have happened?
No, I think the war could have progressed much further in the direction of resolution than it has. But the Biden administration has dragged its feet at every turn. Initially, they came out and warned Iran and Hezbollah not to open a second front. Those warnings have been ignored. And then when Israel wanted to go into Rafah, the southernmost town of Gaza near the Egyptian border, and destroy the remnants of Hamas, the Biden administration said no, and Israel had to delay 3 months. The Biden administration and Vice President Harris specifically said that it would withhold weapons from Israel if it actually went into Rafah, and it did so. So there was a delay of 3 months, and there's also probably been a delay in the attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon. Lots of Israelis feel it could have been done earlier, but Netanyahu was constrained by Biden's demands. No Israeli leader can afford to ignore the United States completely because the U.S. gives so much military aid and economic aid to Israel, especially in wartime. So he has had to listen to Biden and Harris, and they have slowed this down. In April, when Iran fired 300 projectiles, that includes drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, at Israel, Biden came out and said Israel should not retaliate in a way that would escalate the conflict. Well, what do you call attacking someone's country with ballistic missiles that could be tipped with whatever kind of warhead Iran seeks to attach, whether chemical weapons or, God forbid, nuclear weapons, which they are very close to developing? I mean, what should you do? So Biden said, well, Israel was successful at shooting them down with some help from the United States and other countries. Therefore, because these missiles caused no damage, you shouldn't retaliate. But the intention of the missiles was to cause a lot of damage. So Biden has withheld Israel from deterring further attacks. That's why a second one happened. And we're looking at this Biden-Harris administration, and it's actually affected the way I think Americans view the White House commitment to our own security. I mean, look at the border.
Yes.
They won't secure our border. They tell Israel not to fight against terrorists. Well, what will they defend? Their primary concern with the military has been ideological, rooting out any Trump supporters and then indoctrinating everybody in transgenderism. That's not how you build a military. By the way, Israel has transgender soldiers and has for a long time, but they haven't tried to upend the entire concept of gender. Somehow, in our institutions, we're not content with tolerating the one or two people who might be a little different but still want to participate. We have to upend everything for everyone. That's why recruitment rates are down. That's why retention rates are down. That's why we can't field an effective fighting force at the moment. And it's because of this mismanagement. Whereas in Israel, where the choices are much clearer, they make the right ones. I'm not saying we would trade our position for theirs, but we're looking at Biden and Harris and wondering why they're not thinking about American strength, why they're not thinking about projecting an image of resolution, why they're always trying to give in to the bad guys.
Great point. That was essentially the question I did want to get to a moment ago, and we'll throw on top of that Kamala announcing she's given $157 million more to the civilians of Lebanon, while we have Americans right here, North Carolina in particular, who are suffering through Hurricane Helene. Yet we have to give more money to the people of Lebanon for some reason. We only got about a minute, but I want to tie those two last statements you made together. So if the Israeli principle is resolve and responding accordingly, very with clarity, how would you define the Kamala worldview with this issue?
Win the next election. That's her only worldview. She doesn't really have convictions. She comes out of San Francisco and the left, so she has left-wing views when she has views. But basically, Kamala Harris has no real conviction except whatever gets her ahead. She tried to be a tough prosecutor in the early 2000s. Then when that was no longer popular on the left, she tried to be a George Soros-style radical judicial reform or criminal justice reform prosecutor. She doesn't have convictions. The Biden approach is the Obama approach, which is lead from behind, maybe even not lead from behind, but appease from behind. Because remember, the Ukraine war happened because Biden appeased Russia. He lifted the sanctions Trump had on Nord Stream 2 and all of that. So there really is no leadership. The only thing Biden is good at doing is leaving our allies in the lurch, especially Israel. And that's it. There's no real leadership at all. Trump's philosophy is very simple: America first, peace through strength. And you know what? It worked for 4 years. You can't argue with 4 years of peace, not just calm, but actual peace. The Abraham Accords, the expansion of peace throughout the Middle East in a region no one ever thought would have that kind of peace. That was under Trump because people understood America was strong. When America's strong, when America takes care of American interests first, and American interests include defending American allies, nobody messes with us. The world is a more stable place. The contrast is very stark.
Joel Pollak, senior editor-at-large of Breitbart News. And buy the book. Buy it right now. The Agenda, What Trump Should Do in His First 100 Days. An incredible resource to know before the election, when you're trying to get out the vote, encourage people to vote. And then, of course, when he wins this thing, now we gotta win. Now we gotta really win. Joel Pollak, Breitbart News. Good to talk to you, Joel.
Thanks.
Josh Hammer coming up next. He has a new book out talking about the connection between Israel and all of Western civilization and how we need to protect Israel for the sake of all of us. Next. right here on the First TV. Spread the word. Hey, welcome back to our special attack on Israel 1 year later. Unbelievable. Andrew Klavan, he said, I just hope Israel can save Western civilization before Western civilization can stop them. Speaking of our modern worldview today from Kamala and the rest, I want to go to the great Josh Hammer, host of America on Trial, author of the book coming out in a couple months now, but you can pre-order, Israel and Civilization, the Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Josh, great to talk to you, brother.
Mike, always great to see you. Thanks for having me.
I want to get to your book in a second, but first let's just reflect on what happened a year ago and what has happened in the years since. Where's your head at?
Well, it's hard to believe that a year has passed. It really is just, the mind reels. It feels like it were just yesterday. You know, a lot of people say that this was Israel's equivalent of 9/11. And I have mixed thoughts on that comparison. I grew up in the New York area. 9/11 was a formative event in my life. But if you want to do the apples to apples comparison, Israel's a very small country, about 9 million people. It's actually the equivalent of like 12 or 13 9/11s, if you want to play that morbid, macabre comparison. My brother-in-law, for what it's worth, lives in a town called Netivot. My wife comes from an Israeli family. My brother-in-law lives in a town called Netivot, about 5 miles from the Gaza border. I think back at a moment like this to last year during this same weekend when we had no idea for about 2 days whether he was safe, because it's actually happened over a Jewish holiday. They did it over the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah. Religious Jews still use electronics over the holiday. So it was a nightmare for our extended family, as you can probably imagine. So on a personal level, that's what I think to. On a geopolitical level, what I think to is the fact that tragically, virtually nothing has changed. If anything, what's happening on the ground right now is in some ways even more volatile than it was 1 year ago, because Israel's not just fighting a war against Hamas in Gaza. They're fighting a 7-front war, 7 different fronts. Gaza, Lebanon, Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank, Syria, Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and then Iran itself, the head of the snake itself. Wow. And I get asked a lot how this ultimately ends. I don't have a good answer to that question. What I do know is that nothing is ever going to get back to normal until the head of the snake, the Iranian regime, is dealt some severe repercussions for feeding all this mayhem across the region.
Yeah. And this maybe ties into your book. Why should we in America care about Israel? I can sense a lot of people being like, it's over there. I don't care about that, or I shouldn't need to care about that. Why should we care?
Yeah, so there are a few ways to answer this question, right? So, you know, J.D. Vance put it well in a speech that he gave earlier this year for the Quincy Institute. The Quincy Institute is actually a fairly pro-Iran organization. A lot of supporters of U.S.-Israel relations were like, oh my God, what is J.D. Vance doing speaking there? But he actually went to Lion's Den and gave a very forthright, realist, national interest-centric, full-throttle endorsement of tight U.S.-Israel relations. But before J.D. got to that, he made the very elementary but nonetheless salient point that, Mike, as long as America continues to be a Christian majority country, and God willing, it'll be that way for a long time, you will always have people of the book, Jews and Christians alike, who care about this narrow plot of land in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Levant. This is the Holy Land. There are holy sites here. And if for literally no other reason, if nothing else, if you are a Jew or a Christian and your religion, your faith has holy sites there, you care about the fate of those holy sites. That's probably the most simplistic reason why I think a lot of people still to this day have to care a lot. The slightly broader reason, I should say, and I say this as a so-called America First guy, I am just as anti-neoconservative as I am anti-isolationist. I hate what neoconservative foreign policy has done to America when it comes to the boondoggles in Afghanistan, Iraq. I hate it. Blood, treasure, destroyed, trillions of dollars, young lives lost. I am a realist. And as a realist, as an American, I primarily actually care about China. And I support redeploying assets from the Middle East and other troubled spots to China. That raises the question, Mike, how can the United States do that, especially in a world where we still care about the price of energy. We're still going to care about the Middle East for those reasons. We happen to have had 9/11 here. We still care about radical Islam. How can we better make sure the Middle East does not go up in flames while strategically being able to redeploy assets out of the Middle East into the Indo-Pacific? The answer is the Trump administration's foreign policy, this Abraham Accords alliance, which brings together these Iran containment countries of Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, God willing, Saudi Arabia will join. If you can use U.S. diplomacy, currency diplomacy, to embolden our allies to patrol their own part of the world for them, this strategically, morally, historically important part of the world, if you can do that, that will then in turn allow America to redeploy to the Far East, which is our actual civilizational threat this century.
Very well said. We're going to talk in the next segment about Christian Zionism. So I like how you started there and then went up. Let's go one more step up, and this ties more into your book. What is the connection between Israel and the West? And I started with that Klavan quote about Israel saving Western civilization. What's the connection there?
Well, in my book, which you've, generously flagged here, it's out, God willing, this March. In my book, I basically argue that Western civilization begins at Mount Sinai, that it begins with God's revelation to Moses and the ancient Israelites out at Mount Sinai, and that you cannot possibly understand what Western civilization is today unless you understand that very basic fact. I mean, when we use the term the West, a lot of people have no idea what we're actually talking about. And partially that is our own education system's fault, because we're not actually teaching some very basic things. When I use the term the West, what I personally am referring to is the broader biblical tradition, the broader biblical inheritance, the broader Judeo-Christian civilization itself. If you want to go Leo Strauss, then you can maybe say that the combination of revelation and reason, this combination between Mount Sinai and Jerusalem and Aristotle and the Greeks and all of that. But at a bare minimum, what we can all agree on is that it includes revelation, the people of the book, Jews and Christians alike. And if you just abandon the Jews, if the West abandons the Jews, you are abandoning the literal wellspring of all that Western civilization entails today. Historically, that has never ended well. There is not a single instance of a society that has ever turned its back on the Jews, that has ever pogromed the Jews, genocided the Jews, expelled the Jews, discriminated. There's not a single example of a society that has actually benefited as a result of that, which, to kind of, again, preview your segment with Christian Zionism, maybe is itself, part of the biblical prophecy that God will bless those who bless the nation of Israel and punish those who punish that. I would argue that history has actually played that out in real time there. But at a bare minimum, looking at what the West conceives itself as and thinks of itself as, I don't think there's any way that this entire edifice survives unless Jews and Christians come together to ultimately defend our shared inheritance against our three hegemonic barbaric forces that seek to destroy us, which I identify in the book as global neoliberalism, Islamism, and wokeism. Those are our three threats. The peoples of the book, the Jews and Christians alike, have to stand together to defend against those three threats.
Oh, wow. Oh, I can't. We'll do a whole hour-long special on that, on the book, and especially on that last point. That's profound. And yeah, we're going to talk about the Abrahamic covenant of Genesis 12 coming up in just a few minutes. What then is the Kamala Harris worldview? And this really is not a political special, but we have to chat about this a little bit. What's the Kamala worldview when it comes to Israel?
I think it's very troubling to the extent that we can discern any kind of coherent worldview at all, which is a very debatable proposition. There's not really a whole lot that we're even able to discern there. Look, I think that the Kamala Harris-Tim Walz foreign policy is basically the exact same foreign policy of the Biden-Harris administration, which is the exact same foreign policy as the Obama-Biden administration that preceded it. For roughly a half century, America had a bipartisan foreign policy consensus, which is that we generally want to support, all else equal, in the Middle East, Israel and the perceived more moderate Sunni Arab states. That means countries like Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, especially in recent years, Saudi Arabia, now that they have disavowed Islamism. The Obama administration starts to take that and flips it entirely on its head. They deliberately seek to create daylight, that's their literal word, to create daylight with Israel, and then they embolden Israel and the Sunni Arab state's arch enemy, which is Iran. They flip the entire thing on its head in this totally overly academic, overly theorized thing to try to balance out interest and allow America to get out of the region. So they did that. That was the whole point of the Iran nuclear deal. Donald Trump, to his great credit, totally did the opposite, pulled out of the nuclear deal, warmed this back up to Israel, to the Saudis. That's how we got the Abraham Accords. That's how we got peace and stability. The Kamala Harris approach would just be right back to the same failed Barack Obama, Joe Biden paradigm, which, contrary to what they tell you, would actually only lead to more chaos, more jihad, and more war.
We only got 90 seconds. I want to make sure I understand this right. What was the play with Obama and now moving forward, Kamala, with Iran? Like, what was their... What was their, let's give them the benefit of the doubt here, right? Let's steel man their argument. What were they going for?
Yeah. So the most charitable I can possibly be, to the extent that we are not ascribing this to evil or outright malice, which is what I usually do. But if we're trying to be the most charitable possible, I think what the game plan was to say, okay, America is too involved in the Middle East, which, by the way, I agree with. That's what I was saying earlier about doing this to all get our guys out of there to the Indo-Pacific. But I guess from their perspective, they're saying, okay, we're too bogged down in the Middle East. The way to get us out is to balance out these two clashing lines of this divide. So we've gone too far all in for one side. That's the Israel and the moderate Sunni states, Egypt, Saudi, Emirati, and so forth. So on the other side of the ledger, now it's time to embolden the other guys. So namely Iran, Qatar, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay. That's how you got the Obama administration supporting the Arab Spring in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia. You had the failed intervention of Gaddafi in Libya in 2011. It all kind of comes back to this balancing out of strategic interests. To say that this has failed, Mike, I think would be a catastrophic understatement.
Yes, that makes sense. Okay, very good. When's the book come out, Josh?
It's coming out in March 25th, God willing. It's now available for pre-sale on Amazon.com and everywhere else you get your books as well.
Great. It's called Israel and Civilization, Fate of the Jewish Nation, Destiny of the West. Good to talk to you, Josh. Appreciate it.
You bet.
And of course, the podcast right here on the First America on Trial. Coming up next, we'll bring back around to this Christian Zionism and why Christians, I believe, or why the Bible says Christians should support the Jewish people. We'll do that next right here on the First TV. Thanks for being here. Welcome back to our special attack on Israel a year later. I want to wrap up our special here with the question, why should a Christian support the Jewish people? First, let's just for a second look at it from a purely secular perspective, because you should support the Jewish people for this reason too. Let's quote first the consummate atheist Ayn Rand. Here she is on the Phil Donahue show many years ago.
If you mean whose side should one be on, Israel or the Arabs, I would certainly say Israel because it's the advanced, technological, civilized country amidst a group of almost totally primitive savages who have not changed for years and who are racist and who resent Israel because it's bringing industry and intelligence and modern technology into their stagnation.
She wrote something similar. She said, the Arabs are one of the least developed cultures. They're typically nomads. Their culture is primitive, and they resent Israel because it's the sole beachhead of modern science and civilization on their continent. When you have civilized men fighting savages, you support the civilized men no matter who they are. When it comes to the power of the mind, they develop the development of industry in the wasted desert continent versus savages who don't want to use their minds. Okay, that's just from a secular perspective. There's no other country on earth that people call for its extinction. Think about that. No other, other than Israel, there's no other country that there's other countries in the world that are like, you shouldn't exist. And there's no other example of a free state wanting war and the police state wanting peace. But that's what people say about Israel. They say that Israel wants war and it's the terrorist states around them. They're the ones who want peace. Ridiculous. Now, those are all secular analyses. Let's spend a minute here on a Christian perspective. Just do two scriptures. Deuteronomy 7:6 says, for you, speaking of the Jewish people, you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. God could have chosen anyone. Could have chosen people from Mongolia or whatever. He chose the Jewish people. God's eternal purpose is to bless the world through Israel. Genesis 12, the Abrahamic covenant. God's promise is, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. Here's the key for us. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. Here's Pastor John MacArthur speaking to that recently.
These are my chosen people. I have a plan for them. Yes, they have followed idols. Yes, they have been punished and judged. Yes, they rejected their Messiah. Yes, they are still, Jews are living and dying and going out of the presence of God forever now. But still, God has a future plan for the Jewish people, and we have to be protectors of them. I think any nation that tries to eliminate the Jewish people has made a bad decision, because the Bible is filled with the promises of God that no one will annihilate them, and anyone who tries will be annihilated.
Now, a little nuance here, because people may freak out at this. This doesn't mean that we have to support everything that the Israeli government does, or that we have to support them politically, or that Israel can do no wrong. That's not it. It's the Jewish people. MacArthur went on to make this point. He says, there's no biblical promise about protecting Arabs or Scottish people or English people or Hispanic people, but there is a warning from God to be sure that you're protecting Jewish people. And if you do that, God promises to bless you. It's the end of the story. That's it. That's like all of it. If you believe in the Bible and you want to follow the Bible and you believe the Bible is inerrant, all the rest, then that's it. That's the end of the story. that's what you do. So that's why I believe the Christians should support the Jewish people. The Bible says to. I'll leave you with a story that I think about quite often, actually. Again, when you're deciding which people to support, if that's even a question for you. It's the story of two young girls who were held hostage by Hamas. And they were rescued. They're two girls, maybe 7 and 10, something like that. And they ran and hugged their mom. And mom noticed that their hair was beautifully braided. They were held hostage for like 40 days. How was their hair in braids? And their mom asked them, how is your hair so beautiful? And the girl said that it was one of the female Israeli soldiers who was kept hostage with them. She would braid our hair. Why is that story so powerful? To me, it's a story of, first of all, the importance of beauty. It's the importance of hanging on. It's the importance of not giving up. It's a story of hanging on to what matters. Whatever you can, whatever little thing you can hang on to. Which then means ultimately it's a story of hope, which is always a story of love. And I'm always here for one of those. And it's all those things. It makes it even more beautiful when you realize how against the odds they are. Mike Slater, The First TV. Spread the word.